The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Jason Stanley on his latest book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Julie Kohn on lessons learned from the Texas power grid failure, plus Bill Press with White House economic advisor Jared Bernstein. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In his newest book, Jason Stanley makes the case that nations don't have to be fascist to suffer from fascist politics. He says that even with Trump gone, his authoritarian attack on democracy is still being embraced by Republicans. And we say hello to Jason Stanley, the Jacob Orosky Professor of Philosophy at Yale and the author of numerous books, including most recently, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Jason Stanley, thank you for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast, and I'm going to jump right into it. Your most recent book, Warning About Fascist Politics in the United States, came out close to 2 years into Trump's presidency. What did you see evolve over his 4 years in office that confirmed your fears about the rise of fascism in the United States?
So first of all, we saw a more and more open embrace of loyalty to the party and the leader rather than to the rule of law. So, for example, we saw the Republicans holding the Republican National Convention at the White House in open violation of the Hatch Act, in open defiance of the Hatch Act, because the idea was supposed to be that, the law and order means fealty to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. We saw open defiance of electoral law, open defiance of democracy. We saw the rising presence of militias in the public sphere and an unclear connection between the official organs of the state and these militias. Finally, we had an ever more explicit racist element to the Republican Party. So American fascism takes the form of white Christian nationalism. So we saw a kind of open embrace of this, where the Republican Party is going through a kind of doom cycle, whereby they exhibit open racism, as with the Georgia voting laws that allow that were signed under a plantation with an all-white group of lawmakers. So what the Republican Party is doing is they're doing open racism, defying people to call them racist. And when they're called racist, they then say, look, they're calling us racist again. So what we see an embrace of racism, strategically and philosophically. Strategically, because there's a kind of dance that they do. They do something that's openly racist. They're blamed for racism. And then they say, look, the liberals are calling us racist again, cancel culture. So this is a kind of death spiral towards racism, which incentivizes embracing racism both symbolically and in policy.
Well, of course, Trump is gone now, but we live with his legacy, and much of that was on display January 6th. What did you see and hear that day that was illustrative about fascist elements in modern day politics?
Well, in the rally at the Ellipse Park in Washington, D.C., that was addressed by Trump and other Republicans, there was a video played that was as close to fascist politics as one will see, explicit fascist politics. It was anti-Semitic, beginning with a sort of Hollywood sign and featuring Chuck Schumer and Jerry Nadler flanking Nancy Pelosi, the shades of the Jews control everything. Hitler in Mein Kampf talks about the many powerful members of the Austrian Social Democratic Party who are Jewish. The video highlights the Jewish members of the Democratic Party. Hollywood, of course, is affiliated in the anti-Semitic imaginary with anti-Semitism. This whole idea of betrayal by the elites that justifies violence. And finally, you have on January 6th, the final stage of fascism, which is political violence. Political violence directed against the opposition party, justified by the thought that the opposition party is filled with elite globalists whose mission is to destroy the nation.
We're speaking with Jason Stanley, Jacob Borowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale and the author of numerous books, including, most recently, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. And Jason, the Republican Party has been largely silent on Trump's attempt to overturn the election. What's your understanding of why that's the case?
Well, silence is giving it license. That's very familiar from the literature on authoritarianism. Hannah Arendt notes that when the official Nazi party was silent on acts of violence on the street against communists and people opposing the regime, what they were doing is they were condoning it. So when you're silent on malfeasance, what you're doing is condoning it. So the silence should be read as nothing other than the Republican Party's endorsement of Trump's big lie.
And, since Biden has been elected, we have a Republican Party that seems intent on advancing voter suppression as we approach the midterm elections in 2022. In the context of your expertise, what's important to understand about why this is happening?
Well, it fits in with the frame of fascism. So people, when I published my book, said fascism is you're wrong about fascism because the Republican Party is not in any way challenging democracy. They're trying to win elections with their policies. They're not being anti-democratic. And everyone laughed and said, see, it's not fascism. They're not being anti-democratic. They're trying to win elections with far-right politics. Well, now we see the open attack on democracy. We're seeing ever more clearly Republicans embracing the idea that they're a minority party and they're going to portray the Democrats as traitors and traitors to the nation. And so loyalty, Americanness means the Republicans in power and there's no other option. It's an open attack on democracy. So together with the militias, this attack on democracy should be the final signal of concern that we have an openly anti-democratic far-right party that endorses political violence.
And if lawmakers really wanted to reverse the pattern of fascist and anti-democratic politics in the United States, what should they do?
Well, in the short term, we have to pass legislation that bans these clearly anti-democratic laws that are completely inconsistent with the spirit of democracy. We need to do that as soon as possible. So we probably need to get rid of the filibuster. And, we can look at Democrats like Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, and we can clearly see if they don't go along with it, then their faces will be in the history books as the ones complicit, as the ones who are actively complicit in ending democracy in the United States.
All right, Jason Stanley, Jacob Borowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale, and the author of How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jason, we appreciate your time with us today. Look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, reimagining energy in Texas after a deadly disaster. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
These days, the haughty rich in our country have developed such an arrogant sense of self-entitlement that they've gone from being merely irritating to infuriating. Unsurprisingly, their plutocratic greed and rigging of the system has generated a political backlash, including a widely popular push to tax the massive stashes of wealth the upper class has amassed by stiffing the middle class and poor. Alarmed by this uprising, the rich have launched a major effort to diffuse public anger, not by altering their own behavior, but by a semantical twist. Interestingly, since the rich has become such a negative phrase, it is being dropped from the vocabularies of right-wing media, lawmakers, and other defenders of wealth concentration. Rather, they now glorify the millionaire-billionaire class as, quote, high earners and high net worth individuals. Both are awkward phrases, yet both serve to exalt the fortunate few as superior earners and worthy individuals. Words matter because they're powerful social constructs that shape our culture's moral values. For example, even failed CEOs who preside over big losses still collect boodles of cash from the corporate hierarchy, while working stiffs who perform their jobs admirably at the same corporation get pay cuts or even get booted. Boeing, for instance, suffered $12 billion in losses last year, costing 30,000 workers their jobs, yet the top exec was rewarded with $21 million in pay. The establishment media cloaked the greed of the chief by saying he had earned his millions and is now worth such and such money. This is Jim Hightower saying these aren't euphemisms, they're lies. To get the truth, the media might ask ousted workers how much they think the CEO actually earned and is worth. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. After a historic winter storm left millions of Texans in the dark and without heat, energy experts are looking for ways to stop it from happening again. Julie Kohn says that means rethinking the state's isolation from the nation's power grid. And we say hello to Julie Kohn, historian of energy, technology, and the environment, affiliated with both the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute and the University of Houston's Center for Public History. She's also the author of The Grid, Biography of an American Technology. Julie Kohn, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Jim, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're quite welcome, and the pleasure is ours. You recently wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post titled, "Texas Seceded from the Nation's Power Grid, Now It's Paying the Price." And to understand your argument, I think we first need to ask you to explain to us exactly what that power grid is and really why they exist.
Sure. First, it's important to recognize that the word the grid, or the phrase the grid, is a colloquialism. It's not a technical term, and it's used differently by different people. It usually refers to the combination of generating plants, transmission lines, substations that moves electricity from the generating source to a distribution network for customers. Sometimes it also includes the distribution network. But it's a word that makes it easy to think about that system out there that gets electricity to us. In the United States, there are actually three major power networks or grids in North America: the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and the Texas Interconnection, which is also referred to as ERCOT. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, called ERCOT, is the entity that actually operates the grid inside of Texas, although it doesn't own any of the pieces of it. And the development of the grid dates back to the turn of the last century, when power companies were trying to build up their customer base. And they had three big reasons that they wanted to link up with each other and other companies. One was to have better control over their energy resources. So, for example, a power company with a hydroelectric plant could sell a lot of electricity when the water was running high and needed to buy electricity from somebody else when the water was running low. And a coal-fired plant could do the reverse. And in essence, this was a conservation move at the beginning of the 20th century to kind of manage the use of energy resources. The second reason was that if you wanted to build a bigger market and install a bigger generator, you had to reach further. And by interconnecting, power companies could do that. They could build up a diverse base of users, and they could achieve economies of scale. And then the third reason, which is really relevant to what happened in Texas recently, is that by interconnecting, companies could have access to backup power without having to invest in their own backup generating plant or storage batteries. The other thing that's important to know is what the grid is not. And in the United States, it is not a national grid, and we do not have an electricity boss.
Well, and as you describe it, 90% of Texas is intentionally isolated from the rest of the country. How was this decision made, and how much of the decision was a free market sensibility and perhaps a preference for deregulation?
Well, it wasn't the result of a single decision. In fact, this again dates back to the beginning of the last century. Texas power companies, just like power companies everywhere else, chose to interconnect for the same reasons. And some of them, they tended to connect with whoever was nearby initially. So for example, the Houston Lighting and Power Company here where I live in Houston had interconnections eventually that reached all the way into Louisiana, as well as west into other parts of Texas. And they were owned by often holding companies, which owned facilities all over the country. Until 1907, there was almost no regulation of power companies in the United States. In 1907, the first two states started regulating who could generate and deliver electricity and where, and they set the rates for those entities. And by 1920, almost every state in the country had that kind of regulation, but not Texas. So the Texas power companies actually had quite a lot of autonomy, whether they were publicly owned, like a municipal company, or privately owned. In 1935, Congress passed what's known as the Public Utility Holding Company Act. And the intent of this was to break up the holding companies, which by that point were perceived as being in some part responsible for the Great Depression and being unfair to customers and to some of their stockholders. And one of the requirements of that act was that if a company had a lot of properties, say in Texas, Louisiana, Maine, California, et cetera, they would have to sell those off unless they could be interconnected with each other. So the holding companies that had properties in Texas fought this act, as did most of the others around the country. Sometime in the 1940s, most of them had to either go ahead and sell off their properties or interconnect. And companies in Texas, like Houston Lighting Power, again, were sold off. So then they were now truly independent within Texas. And that was around the same time that the Texas power companies decided to form what's known as the Texas Interconnected Systems. And they did this because this was the beginning of World War II. They wanted to participate in the war effort. They wanted to achieve more efficiency and generate more power to support that effort. And I believe it was probably at around that time that they made the decision to keep all of their operations within Texas, because that way there was no regulation in Texas, and they would also not have to face federal regulation. That continued and still continues today, even though there were many other points when either individual power companies or system planners or others said, maybe we should reconsider this. Maybe there would be advantages to connecting outside of Texas. And there have been studies over the past, 30, 40 years looking at this or longer. But for the most part, I think the Texas companies found that it was economically favorable to keep their operations within the state. And over time, it became both technically and physically more difficult to build true interconnections outside the state.
And Julie, your piece explains the outcomes of this decision to operate an independent power grid in Texas. I would say it's best described as a mixed bag. Among other things, you write that the wholesale power market in Texas offers scant incentives for investment in backup power. Why is that the case?
Well, I think the way it was designed, the intent was to show that the market could serve all needs. Again, let me just give a very quick historical perspective. Back in the olden days, when states were regulating all these power companies, and eventually Texas did join the party in 1975, I'm a generator. I build a new power plant. I build enough generation so that I can sell power on normal days and have backup for really bad days. And then I go to the state regulator and I say, I built this power plant. It cost me this much money. I want you to let me charge my customers this rate to recover my costs and make a profit. Once Texas opened up the wholesale power market to competitive generating facilities, that was gone. And the only way a generating facility in Texas gets paid back for its investment in a wind plant, a coal-fired plant, whatever it is in the open market. And we have what's called an energy-only market. So you only get paid when you sell electricity. And it's also a reverse auction. So the way it works is whoever offers their electricity into the grid at the cheapest price, ERCOT takes that first. And they match that to what the anticipated demand will be. And then they take the next cheapest price and they keep building it up until there's going to be enough electricity to meet the demand. And then everybody gets paid the top price. So you only get paid when you're selling electricity and only at whatever the market has risen to in that reverse auction. So let's say you invest in an extra generator to take care of the icy cold winter day. You're not going to get paid for that until the icy cold day happens. And when it happens, you don't know in advance how much you might get paid. Now, the market does provide the opportunity for the price to go from what would be typical $50 per megawatt hour all the way up to $9,000 per megawatt hour under those emergency conditions. But again, it might not be for 10 years that you would get your money back. Mm-hmm. So that's the incentive, and that's the problem with the incentive.
Yeah, I would say so. We're speaking to Julie Kohn, a historian of energy, technology, and the environment, affiliated with both the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute and the University of Houston's Center for Public History. Julie's also the author of The Grid, Biography of an American Technology. So let's talk about what happens when it goes wrong. As the title of your op-ed indicates, Texas is paying the price for leaving the nation's power grid. What would you say is the simplest way to understand what led to that deadly power blackout in February within the context of the state's, let's say, unique power grid and market structure?
Well, there are the proximate causes and the longer term causes. So the proximate causes were, first of all, an unprecedented weather event. We've never had it become, or in recorded history, it hasn't been that cold for that long across that much of Texas. Second, there was an unprecedented winter demand for electricity because it was so cold. Third, generators of all types froze, so there wasn't enough power to meet that unprecedented demand. Fourth, the natural gas supply also froze, which meant that gas-fired power plants couldn't get their fuel once they were able to start generating it again. And fifth, the planning entity saw that the grid was heading into a power failure, which is different in kind from what we actually experienced. It looked like the grid was going to shut down. So they initiated the rolling blackouts, which eventually became longer-term blackouts that lasted while the supply failed to return to meet demand over the course of several days. So that was what happened in terms of the immediate experience. What were the longer-term issues? Well, the generators, although there had been recommendations to do so, had failed to weatherize their facilities. That's why they froze. There was a failure to follow through on some simple protections that could have alleviated some of the problem. And what I mean by that is that after a similar but not as bad storm in 2011, there was a recommendation that the gas suppliers, the people who operate the gas pipelines, apply to be essential services, which would mean that when there's a rolling blackout, their power would still stay on. And this, so normally, if there's going to be a rolling blackout for whatever reason, you keep the power on at the police station, the hospitals, the fire station, so on and so forth. And there was a simple 2-page form these entities could fill out to say, we need to be an essential service also, so that they could keep the gas supply going to the gas-fired power plants. And many of them failed to do that because it was not a requirement and there was nobody looking over their shoulder to make sure it was done. Third, there was the failure of market incentives to produce extra protections and backup power, as we discussed previously. And then this is a conjecture on my part, but I believe fourth, ERCOT in its planning scenarios probably didn't anticipate this kind of winter storm. And so when they looked at, do we have enough power for a winter storm, they were relying on the experiences of the last 20, 30 years, and they planned for that and they thought they'd be okay. And it was just so much colder and for so much longer that we weren't okay. Mm-hmm. There is no coordination of substantial merit at the state level for different energy systems. And I think that was another major issue. I mentioned this problem with the natural gas pipelines. The natural gas pipelines in the state are regulated by what's called the Texas Railroad Commission, which has nothing to do with trains. And the electric power system is regulated by the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and the two have nothing to do with each other in a formal way. So that's a really serious problem. And then from my personal perspective, I felt there was insufficient notice to the public of what might happen in the context of the pending storm. I wasn't expecting to be that cold that week for that long.
Yeah, right. Well, and in fact, I have a friend who lives not too far from Houston and went through the same thing, and every day was thought, well, when is this going to end? When is this going to end? And it got scary for them. He's got a couple of little kids, and it was kind of scary for him. And you mentioned the megawatt, where it's normally around $50 and it jumps up to $9,000. So in addition to the system failing, customers also received huge electricity bills for the time period following the storm. How is that connected to the way the wholesale power market is designed in Texas? I think there might be a little bit of disconnect as to how that could happen.
Sure. And it's important to note that was a small percentage of all power customers in the state. So in addition to having a competitive wholesale power market, Texas has a competitive retail market, which some refer to as the power to choose. That means each year I get to pick my electricity provider, and I can choose among providers who offer a fixed rate. It'll be so many cents per kilowatt hour for the next year or the next 2 years or whatever, no matter how much electricity I use. Or you could get a variable rate where it's so much up to 1,000 kilowatts. And then, if you use more than that, you have to pay a higher price, or if you use Less than that, you have to, there are all these different variable rates. And then there were plans like one that's infamously now called Gritty, where you pay a very small amount per month. I think it's $10 per month. And the rest of your monthly bill is tied to the wholesale price of electricity. And this was conceived, I believe, to help power customers have more control over their energy use and their energy bill. If you paid attention, you could see, oh, the price is going up. I'm going to wait until it goes down again to run my dishwasher or whatever your electrical appliances are. And we actually know people who signed up with Gritty, and they're, electricity nerds or household finance nerds or whatever, and they watch carefully and they decide when to run which thing. And when Gritty warned their customers that prices might go up because of the winter storm, they actually said, okay, that's it, we're done with Gritty, we're switching over to a fixed rate plan. So it was really a caveat emptor situation, a buyer beware situation, because these plans were designed to do exactly what they did, which is follow the wholesale price. Now, personally, I think for the average customer, that kind of tracking is much too sophisticated or of not much interest to the average customer. And so people who chose those plans because in most months they're really cheap, way cheaper than the fixed rates. In February, they were far and beyond the opposite of that. They were exorbitantly expensive and bank breaking for some households. So the way that it's linked to the wholesale market is that the price is actually tied to that wholesale price.
Mm-hmm. But here's the thing that gets me. You're isolated right there in Texas. In other words, if for some reason you thought, gosh, maybe the Eastern grid could help us, or maybe the Western grid can help, that's not an option for Texas, is it?
Not currently, no. That's correct. Yeah.
And that to me is, well, that's all well and good that I've found out a really cheap way to get my energy. But when I'm not even getting any energy because it's all shut down because they haven't winterized, which they wouldn't expect they'd need to do, it's kind of a scary thought to me, to where you lay yourself. I guess a lesson has been learned, I hope.
I hope so too. Yeah.
Well, and then, of course, Texas regulators now face that challenge of reforming the system, I would think, to avoid a disaster such as what happened in February from happening again. What do you see as some of the key decisions that need to be taken on?
Well, I think there are a number, and it's important to recognize that both legislators and policymakers have to reckon with this situation, because some of the framework of our system is established by state law, and other parts are established by the policies made by the Public Utility Commission. So both legislators and policymakers have to get on board with fixing the problem. And our state legislature is in session right now. Your listeners may not know this, but they meet for 5 months every other year. So it's a very intense and quick legislative session. But this has been top of mind for obvious reasons. And so they're considering various pieces of legislation right now. I think there's some really short-term obvious things to do that could have very clear long-term benefits. The first being high-level coordination of the energy systems and other essential utilities like water and transportation and so forth, so that people are planning together for these kinds of weather events and responding to them in real time together. And then the second would be to review the system planning tools that are used to assure that weather patterns, new and emerging weather patterns, are addressed within the state planning. And then the third, of course, would be to get all those gas service providers to fill out the 2-page paperwork to be sure they have electricity on so they can get the fuel to the gas-fired power plants. A little longer term, I think it behooves the legislature and the Utility Commission to reassess both the wholesale and retail markets and determine how they could better build in both incentives and guardrails so that the next time there's either a hurricane or a winter storm or an excessive heat wave in the summer, the system is better prepared to address it. I think another really important thing, which people haven't spoken about as much, is to assess off-grid resilience. In other words, maybe the state should be looking at helping all dwellings insulate against both very hot and very cold temperatures. Maybe look at better insulation of water systems in homes and apartment buildings. Maybe expand plans for warming and cooling centers during major weather events and identifying at-risk populations and figuring out how you're going to relocate those people if necessary. We do some of that because we have hurricanes, but those preparations could be expanded to address all other, a lot of other kinds of emergency scenarios. Up-leveling the warning systems so people know what to expect. Researching islanding options, setting up smaller microgrid scenarios where different areas could be islanded if you're shutting down portions of the larger grid and could still have power locally, at least for short periods of time. So, there's a variety of those kinds of things. And then much longer term, going back to the point you made before, I think it's time to revisit the studies that have looked at building stronger links between Texas and the other interconnected systems. There are benefits to doing that. Some are obvious, like perhaps accessing more backup power during a winter storm or maybe even the summer. There are also economic benefits for certain generators, like the wind generators in the Texas Panhandle would probably love to sell their power to other customers not in Texas when it's super windy. And then there are some really big challenges. There's the cost of building the transmission infrastructure. There's a question of whether or not the public will have, a palate for agreeing to see that infrastructure built through their communities and across their properties. Recently, there's been a lot of opposition to new energy infrastructure. So big transmission lines are not exempt from that.
Yeah, and there's a big fight about new transmission lines and gas lines in the Mid-Atlantic area right now going on. Right. It have been going on for several years and continue. Right. So that is a tough one. I wondered if the option of perhaps working out some way to tie into one or both of the other major grids, east and west, was on the table. Is that realistic that would actually come to fruition?
I don't know that it's either realistic or not realistic politically. I think it's really more a question of whether or not the benefits will ultimately outweigh the costs. And I also think it's a very long-term solution. I mean, it takes something like 10 years plus to conceive of a big transmission line and then get it into operation. So that's something that I hope that people will look at really seriously and better understand in a very straightforward way how this could benefit the state, ways in which it might not be beneficial. It would put us in the position of helping others as well. So we have to assess, does that make sense? And then electrically, there are questions because the Texas grid, even though it went through this experience recently, historically has been a very reliable grid. And so to coordinate operations with another very large grid that's, significantly larger, like 10 times larger, that requires certain technical interventions. I don't think I could begin to envision what those are, but that requires technical interventions that will take some time to work out if in fact that becomes the desirable solution.
Okay. Julie Kohn, historian of energy technology and the environment, author of The Grid, Biography of an American Technology, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Julie, we appreciate it. Great having you with us. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with White House economic advisor Jared Bernstein on the limits of trickle-down economics and why Biden's big infrastructure plan is the right response.
I'm curious, the president gets a daily briefing, an intelligence briefing every day. How often does he get a briefing on the economy?
I believe it's a weekly briefing in terms of economists sitting in the Oval. But we're in touch every day on economic matters, including this morning, where the president wanted to hear about a couple of reports that came out, including unemployment claims and retail sales. So trust me, he is extremely interested in making sure his economics team is keeping our fingers on the economy's pulse, with particular reference to how our policies are playing out.
And if he were on this conversation, part of this conversation, and he asked you, how would you score the economy? How are we doing today? What would you tell him?
Yeah, I would tell him that some of the measures that have his fingerprints on them, and some of the measures that we hope will, in good time, be legislated, they're important. They're having an impact, and particularly if you look at the impact of the checks, as part of the questions I was just telling you about, I checked in with the Treasury and got information about well over 150 million checks out, accounting for over $300 billion, and that we saw that reflected in the retail sales. So I think the important kind of focus there would be that this recovery is definitely underway, but it's as he's always said, it's a function of getting the virus behind us. That is occurring in no small part because of the logistics and organization around the rescue plan, virus prevention, control, and of course distribution of the vaccine. But we've got a long way to go, and there are still almost 17 million claims being made on unemployment insurance. That's highly elevated. There's over 8 million jobs still not there from pre-crisis levels. So we've got a way to go, but we're moving there in the right direction with some alacrity.
You indicate you've already seen some direct impact positively from the stimulus package. Do you anticipate a post-pandemic bounce? Let's say once we reach herd immunity and really start to open up?
Well, this is very much the most common anticipation among every forecast I've seen. Just this morning, I was looking at some of the most updated forecasts and saw estimates for the first and second quarter that suggest a growth rate in the first half of the year of real GDP somewhere in the neighborhood of, say, 6 to 7%. Now, of course, that's well above trend. And it is a function of a number of factors, some of which we've mentioned. First of all, the bounce back from, of course, the very deep pandemic-induced recession. The impact of the American Rescue Plan is firmly in the mix there. We have well over $300 billion in checks out the door. We have a vaccination curve that has been increasingly steep, and that's helping people feel more confident about re-engaging with commerce. There's lots of pent-up savings. Some of that also comes from relief packages as well. So all of this is expected to fuel a significantly above-trend growth rate. But I have to be very clear about this point, Bill. From President Biden's perspective, of course that's important, of course it's welcomed, and of course we'll be touting it. But unless those growth rates, and unless the economy is reaching folks who've heretofore been left behind, the folks in the bottom leg of the K in what's been a K-shaped recovery, he will be very unsatisfied. So our measures are being sure to target those folks, often in communities of color, who haven't benefited enough from economic growth in recent years and even recent decades.
So with the American Rescue Plan passed and we're seeing the impact of it, the focus now really shifts to what you're calling the American Jobs Act. First, tell us, how important is this to economic recovery?
I cannot underscore enough how important this is, not just to economic recovery, it's important to that, but to the sustainability, to the resilience, to how robust not just the next economic expansion is, but the one after that. This is a bold, it is a once-in-a-generation investment in creating good-paying jobs, yes, but also laying the foundation for growth for years to come. That requires investments in areas of what economists call public goods in our economy that have been disinvested in for decades. Clean energy, broadband, an electric grid that we saw fail tragically in Texas recently. Water that doesn't allow lead to leach into the bodies of our kids, modernizing schools, childcare buildings, ports, airports, rail. That's just, a broad-based 30,000 feet up view of the importance of the jobs plan.
And when you see, can you anticipate number of jobs might be created, let's say if the entire package were approved?
Yeah, the group Moody's.com, they did an estimate of precisely that, the impact of the rescue plan and the jobs plan. And they found, and by the way, this is important, this also accounts for underlying job growth that we'd expect in what economists call the baseline. So you're going to get some job growth just based on that alone. And put it all together, and they predict 19 million jobs over the next decade. Now, again, some of that's the baseline, some of that's the rescue plan, some of that's the jobs plan. But if you look at the last year in there, so just to give you a little more detail, you look at 2030, 3 million of those jobs are assigned to the American jobs plan.
And I guess this gets to a broader philosophical question, doesn't it, about how to create jobs? I mean, the Republican Party ideal, I guess, has always been we give tax breaks to the big corporations, tax breaks to the millionaires and the billionaires, and then that money trickles down and creates jobs. This plan, as I read it, seems to be saying just the opposite. The way to create jobs is public investment.
Right. I think that the more you depend on trickle down versus direct public investment, the fewer jobs you'll create, and particularly from the perspective of middle and lower income working Americans. The trickle-down experiment, which we've seen time and time again, has consistently failed to have virtually any of its advertised effects. Probably the most important example for us right now is the prediction that the Trump tax cuts would significantly juice business investment. That was part of the sale there, and the idea was that they would bump up business investment, which would trickle down to productivity, which would trickle down to workers' wages, and that first link in that chain, business investment, just wasn't there. We've consistently rejected any kind of trickle-down philosophies in favor of A, more direct public investment of the type we've been talking about, but B, making sure that the wealthy and corporate America who've benefited most from economic growth in recent years pay their fair share in order to help finance these public investments that are so critical to the lives and communities of working Americans.
And the American Jobs Act, also known as the Infrastructure Plan, I've heard the president speak about this. Where does the United States rank among developed countries in terms of maintaining and improving our infrastructure?
Yeah, not nearly high enough. I've seen numbers like 13 in the rankings, and that is a very important motivator for the president. If you look at the share of GDP going for innovation, going for public investment, you see that that's really fallen quite steeply over these years of disinvestment that I've been complaining about in our discussion thus far. And that is something the American Jobs Plan is pointedly designed to reverse. The president likes to talk about how in many of these areas, China's been out investing us. That's not an acceptable ranking to him.
I've also seen where you are looking at basically doing a scorecard, a report card for the states in terms of their investment. Are you up to date on that? And what are some of the states that are the worst or some of the best?
I'm not up to date on that, on the individual states. I've seen the scorecard that we have cited from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and that gives our infrastructure something like a C or a C minus. And again, an unacceptably low grade for an unacceptably low grade for the U.S. economy, an economy that needs to be the most invested in the world.
Right. So following the discussion, as I have just in the news on the American Jobs Act, it seems there are two big questions: what's in it, and two, how do we pay for it? So let's talk about each of those. First, what's in it? There's a lot more in it than most people would define as classic infrastructure. Would you agree?
Certainly, if the definition of infrastructure is roads and bridges and potholes, we go much further than that, because in our view, investing in infrastructure means investing in any structure that improves the lives of working Americans. So, for example, I've had Republicans say in debates that I've been engaged in that they're talking about pipes as problematic under this definition. Well, first of all, pipes are pretty classical infrastructure, but you have to recognize that we're talking about the fact that 400,000 schools and childcare centers have lead exposure in their water. That is a dramatically failing element of America's infrastructure. Broadband, you've had some folks say, how can broadband be infrastructure? Well, first of all, broadband quite closely fits the definition I just gave you, a structure missing from the lives of more than 30 million Americans who have limited or no internet access, who need it in order for their kids to get educated and for them to engage in our economy. And so that to us is classically infrastructure: modernizing schools, childcare buildings, ports, airports, rail. All of those are parts of the jobs plan, and all of those fit, I think, very neatly under the president's definition, broad as we like it to be, of infrastructure.
The one, in addition to the ones that you mentioned, the one that I hear, and again, we know that Mitch McConnell called the Jobs Act a Trojan horse. He said it was a slush fund for unrelated bad ideas. But the one that I hear people talking most about that may not fit is $400 billion for home health care. How do you squeeze that into infrastructure?
I will definitely speak to that. It's a fair question. Let me first say, though, about some of the political complaints. So I read in the paper the other day that our Transportation Secretary, Secretary Buttigieg, said, and I quote, "My phone is ringing off the hook." And what he was talking about was people calling him from both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, from Capitol Hill, talking to him about projects that they need. And Mitch McConnell himself has been talking about the importance of a bridge in his district. So one has to be, I think, mindful of some of the politics that gets played around this. I think it's also critical to recognize how well these measures are polling, not just among Democrats, these kinds of investments. Now, I'm not talking about checks to households. Those polled really well, too, as you'd expect. I'm talking about the jobs plan, the infrastructure plan. Okay. I mentioned that investing in structures that will improve the lives of working Americans. One structure that's missing in this economy, economists call it a missing market, meaning a sector in the economy that just isn't there and needs to be, is in the childcare sector. We simply don't have the childcare infrastructure in place, whether it's people or places, that will enable working parents to safely get to work and to be able to access and afford quality childcare. So I completely justify that investment as part of the American Jobs Act.
And the, I guess it's called home health care,
Right. Sorry, you mentioned home health. Yeah, this is the case for childcare, but it's also the case for elder care, and that's where the home health care comes in.
Bill Press with Jared Bernstein. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Jason Stanley, Julie Kohn, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.